The moment I walked through the door of the Ashford family home in Oakville, holding a casserole dish I'd bought from Whole Foods and pretending it was homemade, his mother looked at me the way you look at a scratch on a new car, not angry, just disappointed that it existed. "So this is her," she said to no one in particular. My boyfriend squeezed my hand. I smiled, and I thought, good, keep thinking that. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the part that came before it. 3 years earlier, I was engaged to a man I'd met in my residency program. We were both in medicine. He was finishing his fellowship in cardiology. I was a hospitalist at St. Michael's in Toronto. And on paper, we looked like one of those couples who has everything figured out. We'd been together for 4 years. I thought we were building something. The engagement fell apart 8 months before the wedding. It didn't fall apart dramatically. There was no screaming, no affair, no single terrible moment. It fell apart slowly, the way ice melts in March. You don't notice it until suddenly there's nothing left to stand on. The thing that broke us was something I still have trouble saying out loud without feeling a complicated mix of pride and shame. I got promoted. I became the attending physician in charge of a ward, took on a consulting role, and my income jumped to just over $210,000 a year. His was $140,000. He never said it directly. Men like him rarely do. But the comments started. "Little ones, you never have time anymore. You've changed. You're always working. You act like this job is your whole personality." And then one evening, after I'd come home late from a double shift, he said something that I've turned over in my mind probably 10,000 times since. "I feel like I'm dating my boss." He gave the ring back in February, said he needed space to figure out who he was. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Leslieville and spent the first month barely getting off the couch on my days off. My best friend Tara, not a doctor, thank God, just a completely grounded woman who worked in urban planning and brought me takeout pho twice a week, told me I was grieving not just the relationship but the version of my future I'd been planning around, someone who couldn't handle me. She was right. She usually is. I went back to work. I threw myself into it. I was fine, mostly. I dated a little, nothing serious. I turned 31. I cut my hair. And then I met Tim. I want to be honest about how it started, because I'm not proud of the impulse, even if I understand where it came from. I met him at a fundraiser for a children's literacy program. The hospital was a sponsor, and I'd been volunteered to attend by my department head, which meant I showed up in a blazer I'd had for 6 years, carrying a glass of mediocre white wine, not particularly wanting to be there. He was standing near the silent auction table, looking equally uncomfortable. Tall, dark hair going slightly gray at the temples, the kind of face that looked better the longer you looked at it. He was a civil engineer, he told me. He worked on infrastructure projects, bridges, water systems, the kind of work that keeps a city functioning without anyone ever thinking about it. His name was Callum. We talked for 2 hours. I told him I worked in healthcare, which was true, and vague enough to be misleading, which was intentional. When he asked what kind of healthcare, I said hospitalist. When he asked what that meant, I described it in the most unglamorous terms I could. I manage patient care on the wards, a lot of paperwork, a lot of coordinating with other departments, and watched his face to see if his interest changed. It didn't. We exchanged numbers. He texted the next morning. Here is where I have to be honest about what I was thinking, because I've asked myself 100 times whether it was calculated or whether it was fear, and the answer is that it was both, which somehow makes it worse and more understandable at the same time. I decided not to correct the impression I'd given him. Not forever, I told myself. Just long enough to know if he was real. Just long enough to see how he treated a woman he thought was ordinary. No prestige, no significant income, no status to attach himself to. My ex hadn't cared about my money in a gold-digging sense. He'd cared about it in a fragile ego sense. And I couldn't tell the difference anymore from the outside. I didn't know how to screen for it without the test. So I let him believe I was just a hospitalist who made a comfortable but unremarkable living. I drove my old Civic instead of the Audi I'd recently bought. I mentioned rent once or twice in passing. I wore clothes I'd had for years on our early dates, not because I was trying to look poor exactly, but because I wasn't trying to look like anything. I was trying to look like myself without the packaging. The first 2 months, it was just us. Easy and quiet and genuinely good in a way I hadn't expected. He cooked for me at his apartment in Hamilton. Nothing fancy, pasta and a jar of sauce he doctored with garlic and fresh basil, and it was somehow the best meal I'd eaten in a long time. He called when he said he would. He listened when I talked. He asked follow-up questions about things I'd mentioned weeks earlier, which I have always believed is one of the truest indicators of whether someone is actually paying attention. He told me early on that his mother was difficult. He said it plainly, without drama, the way you'd describe a weather pattern. She runs hot, she has opinions about everything, she loves me in a way that sometimes makes things complicated. I appreciated the warning. I didn't understand yet what it meant. I met her for the first time at a Sunday dinner in Oakville, his family home. His mother, Eleanor, his younger brother, Declan, his sister-in-law, and 2 small kids who ran in and out of the kitchen the entire evening. Eleanor was elegant in the way of women who have made elegance a discipline, not natural, but maintained with effort and intention. She wore a silk blouse on a Sunday at home. She had the kind of handshake that isn't quite a handshake, where the other person takes your fingers rather than your hand, and you're left feeling like you reached for something and missed. "Callum's mentioned you," she said, and then didn't elaborate on what he'd mentioned or whether it was good. Declan was fine. Warm enough, distracted by his kids, asked me a few genuine questions. His wife Shay was kind in a way that felt like she'd learned to be a buffer in this family over several years of practice. Eleanor's problem with me revealed itself slowly over the course of the meal. She kept talking around it, the way you circle an airport before you're clear to land. She asked about my apartment, my car, my family. My parents were teachers in Guelph, which landed with a particular flatness at that table. She asked whether I had plans to move into something more specialized in my career, which was the politest possible way of asking if I intended to make more of myself. When Callum got up to help clear plates, she leaned slightly toward me across the table and said, "He works so hard. He deserves someone who can match that energy." I smiled. I said, "He really does." I drove home that night and sat in my car in the parking garage for 15 minutes. I should have said something. I knew it even then. But I also knew that if I revealed everything right then, the attending position, the consulting income, the research grants, it would look like I'd been hiding it for a reason. Which I had been, just not the reason she would assume. So I stayed quiet, and the months went on. Eleanor's campaign was subtle but consistent. She mentioned women she admired at regular intervals, a lawyer friend's daughter, a woman from her book club who'd been promoted to VP somewhere, a former colleague who'd made something of herself. She never said directly that I wasn't good enough. She just kept holding up other women like mirrors, hoping I'd see the comparison. What she didn't know was that I was watching Callum through all of it. He never repeated her comments to me with approval. He never looked embarrassed when she implied I was lacking. Once, when she made a remark at a birthday dinner about how important it was for couples to be financially compatible, he put his fork down and said quietly, "Mum, I think we're fine," and changed the subject. It was a small thing, but I stored it. 4 months in, he told me he loved me. We were walking along the waterfront in Burlington on a cold November evening, and he just said it, mid-sentence, like it had been waiting to get out. I stood there in the wind and felt something in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. Not the relief of being loved, but the terror of it. The terror of having let someone in without my usual armor on. I set it back. I meant it completely. I also thought, I have to tell him. I know, I should have told him sooner. Looking back, month 4 was already too late, but I want you to understand what I was afraid of, because I think it's something a lot of women understand even if they'd never have done what I did. I was afraid that if I told him early, I would spend the rest of the relationship wondering if he'd stay because of me or because of what I offered. wondering if his patience and his gentleness and the way he remembered everything were real, or were the behavior of a man who understood which side his bread was buttered on. I'd rather be loved as nothing than adored as something. That's the closest I can get to explaining it. I told him in January, 5 months in. We were at my apartment, the Leslieville one, not the nicer place I'd quietly been considering moving into. I'd made dinner, something I actually cooked this time, and after we'd eaten, I sat across from him at the kitchen table and said I needed to tell him something I should have said earlier. He waited. No reaction on his face yet, just attention. I told him I was an attending physician. I told him about the promotion, the consulting work, what I earned. I told him about my ex-fiancé and why I'd been afraid and what I'd been trying to understand about him, and that I knew it wasn't fair and that I was sorry. He was quiet for a long time. "How long have you known you wanted to tell me?" he asked. "Since about month 2, I said honestly. I kept finding reasons to wait. "Okay," he said. "Okay?" "I mean, I need a minute." He pushed back from the table and walked to the window. Stood there looking out at the street. I sat with the silence, which was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Then he turned around. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not thrown off. I feel a bit stupid, honestly. Looking back at things." He paused. "But I don't think you were trying to make me feel stupid. I think you were scared." I was. Of me. Of the situation. Of being wrong about you. I've been wrong before about what love looked like. He came back to the table. He sat down. He looked at me for a long time. "I need a few days," he said. "Not because I'm angry, because I want to think clearly." He called me 3 days later. He said he'd talked to his sister. He has an older sister in Vancouver, the sensible one he goes to for honest perspective. And she'd said something that stuck with him, if you'd known from the beginning. Would anything have been different? And his answer was no. He'd liked me before he'd known anything useful about me. That didn't change. We agreed that there would be no more versions of me to discover. Everything on the table, going forward. He also said, gently, that he thought I should probably tell a therapist about the ex-fiancé and what that had done to my ability to trust, which was the most emotionally intelligent thing anyone has ever said to me in a moment of conflict, and I found it both annoying and deeply attractive. Eleanor found out at Easter. Not from me directly. From Callum, who had clearly decided that he was finished managing his mother's perception of his girlfriend. He told her, apparently in the kitchen while I was in the living room with Declan's kids watching them argue over an Easter basket. I didn't know it was happening until I heard Eleanor's voice go very quiet in that particular way it had, the one that meant she was recalibrating. She came out to the living room and looked at me differently. I can't explain exactly how. She didn't become warm, Eleanor is never warm, but the specific quality of her disapproval shifted. I'd been found wanting before. Now I was something else entirely, and she wasn't sure yet what to do with that. Later that afternoon, while Callum was outside with Declan, she sat down next to me in the kitchen while I was helping to put away dishes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You should have said something sooner." "You're right," I said. "I should have." She looked surprised. I think she'd expected me to defend myself. "I was afraid," I said. "I made a choice based on fear, and it wasn't fair to Callum. But I think the fact that it took me this long to feel safe enough to tell him says something about what this family felt like to walk into." She was very still. "I'm not trying to be unkind," I said. "I just think if we're going to be honest with each other, that's worth saying." She picked up a dish towel. She folded it. She said, "He seems happy." "I hope so," I said. "I'm trying to deserve that." She didn't apologize. Not exactly. Eleanor is not an apologizing woman. But something shifted after that. The pointed comments stopped. When I came to family events, she introduced me with my full professional title, which I suspected was her version of an olive branch. A way of incorporating me into the family narrative in a way she could be proud of, even if the path there had been unorthodox. She pulled me aside at a family barbecue in August and said, with the low, conspiratorial voice of someone who had been waiting to say this for months, I have never seen her treat anyone the way she started treating you, and I've been in this family for 11 years. Whatever you said to her in the kitchen at Easter, thank you." I didn't know what to do with that except laugh. Callum and I got engaged in September. No big gesture, he's not a big gesture person, which suits me perfectly. We were making breakfast at my apartment, the nicer one I'd finally moved into, and he just asked, "Standing in the kitchen, barefoot, holding a spatula?" I said, yes, before he'd finished the sentence. His mother came to the engagement dinner his family hosted the following month. She wore her best silk blouse. She told her friends I was a physician and said it. I noticed was something that might have been pride, or might have been relief, or might have been relief, or might have been both. Declan shook my hand at the end of the night and said, "She's never cooked a full turkey dinner for someone's engagement before, just so you know." That's basically a public apology in this family. I thought about my ex-fiancé, the ring given back in February, the feeling of standing in a parking garage not knowing who I was without the future I planned. I thought about all the things fear costs you when you let it run too long unchecked. And I thought about Callum in his kitchen in Hamilton, stirring jar sauce on a Tuesday night like it was the most natural thing in the world, not knowing anything about me except that I was worth talking to. I'd been right to want to know the truth about him. I'd been wrong about how long to wait for it. But standing in his mother's dining room, with a ring on my finger and the smell of turkey in the air, and Declan's kids chasing each other around the table, I thought, you got there, and so did he. That's enough. I think about the version of me that stood in that parking garage in February, 3 years before any of this happened, sitting in a cold car trying to figure out where she'd gone wrong. She hadn't gone wrong. That's the thing I wish I could tell her. She'd just learned something expensive about the difference between a person who loves you and a person who loves the version of you that makes them feel safe. Fear does funny things to how you move through the world after something like that. It doesn't always look like fear. It looks like caution, like wisdom, like strategy. I told myself I was being smart when I drove the old Civic. I told myself I was protecting something real, and in some ways I was. But I was also doing something harder to admit. I was giving myself an exit before I'd even let anything begin. If he turned out to be wrong for me, I could tell myself it didn't count, that he never really knew me anyway. It's the kind of quiet dishonesty you practice on yourself first, before you practice it on anyone else. What I didn't expect was Callum, not the version of him I'd constructed a test around, but the actual man. The one who put his fork down at his mother's table and said, simply, "We're fine," and meant it. The one who, when I finally told him the truth, didn't ask why I'd lied as much as he asked what I'd been afraid of. That question changed everything. It was the right question. It was the question of someone who was more interested in understanding me than in being right about me. Eleanor is a study in what happens when a person spends decades confusing control with care. She loved her son. I believe that completely. But she expressed it in a way that made the people around him feel like they were being evaluated rather than welcomed. The comments, the comparisons, the silk blouse on a Sunday at home, none of it made her a villain. It made her someone who hadn't yet learned that the people we love don't need us to guard them. They need us to trust them. What I've come to understand, slowly, is that the 3 things that actually held the story together had nothing to do with my salary or my job title. The first was the choice to eventually be honest, not perfectly timed, not without cost, but honest. Integrity isn't the absence of mistakes. It's the willingness to correct them even when it's uncomfortable. I waited too long and I said so, and that mattered. The second was the work of actually thinking clearly about what I needed and why, not just reacting to old pain, but examining it. Understanding that my ex's fragility wasn't a verdict on me, that I'd internalized a lesson I didn't have to keep. That kind of clear-headedness is something you have to choose repeatedly, even when choosing fear is easier. And the third, the one that doesn't get talked about enough, is the willingness to keep going after you've been hurt badly enough to stop. To show up to a Sunday dinner in Oakville carrying a casserole dish and a 5-month secret and sit at someone's table anyway, that takes something. I'm still not entirely sure what to call it except necessary. Callum asked me once, early on, what I was most proud of professionally. I told him about a patient I'd helped stabilize during a particularly complicated night shift. Nothing dramatic, just good judgment under pressure. The kind of thing that doesn't make headlines but keeps someone alive. He said, like exactly the kind of person he wanted to know. He was right about me before I let myself be right about him. That, more than anything, is what I carry forward.